Good tidings, ladies and gentlemen of the lodge, and welcome back. I hope you're ready to talk some Kingdom Hearts, because today's video will be all about that, with a little bit of Norse mythology thrown in. Kingdom Hearts has always taken inspiration from mythology and religious stories in the past. However, as of late, we are starting to see the series cozy up to Norse mythology. We see this pretty clearly in Dark Road with the inclusion of characters like Odin and Balder, but the finale of Union Cross showed a lot of parallels with the Norse myth of Ragnarok, and I'm here today to point out those parallels and give a quick mythology lesson. So buckle up, sickos and normies, we are on our way to Daybreak Town, but before we arrive, let's quickly discuss the Norse myth Ragnarok. Starting with the word Ragnarok, that phrase alone has several different interpretations, but all those interpretations are all orbiting the same idea. Translations of the phrase include fate of the gods, end of an age, the doom of the gods, the twilight of the gods. To break down the word itself, the first part, Ragna, is a plural of the word reign, meant to signify the ruling powers. In Norse mythology's case, we have the gods. In Daybreak Town, we have the Master of Masters and the Foretellers, but more on that later. Then, we have the second part of the word, which has led to the multitude of interpretations. Rock can be translated as fate, cause, relation, origin, development, etc. So as we see, the word Ragnarok alone signifies the end of an age where the ruling powers of a specific order are brought to an end. So now that we know what the word itself means, what events are led to transpire as a consequence of this event? As it is told, Ragnarok featured a plethora of natural disasters and a submersion of the world in water, followed by the death of the gods, otherwise known as the ruling powers, as stated before. After these events, the world begins to resurface anew, pure and blank, as one might say. The survivors will return, and the world is to be repopulated by the lone survivors. This is, of course, a very brief summary, but I'm sure many of you are starting to see the parallels already. We will get into more detail about the events of Ragnarok throughout the video, but if this intrigues you, I highly recommend reading up on the myth yourself, as Ragnarok is certainly one of the most epic stories that mythology has to offer. However, without further ado, let's talk about the parallels of the Norse myth Ragnarok and its overlap and similarities with that of Union Cross. Our first example is one that's pretty on the nose. As discussed before, Ragnarok signals the death of the gods. Roughly speaking, gods sit at the top of the hierarchy established in the Norse mythos. When we look at Daybreak Town, the top of the hierarchy sits the Master of Masters and the Foretellers. We see that the disorder in Daybreak Town starts when the Master disappears, thus beginning the end of the ruling hierarchy. With the absence of the Master, the Foretellers are left to watch over Daybreak Town among themselves. However, this leads to chaos and betrayal among the Foretellers, much like the gods, and the group begins to fight amongst themselves, in much the same way the gods waged war on one another in Ragnarok. And as we know it, much like Ragnarok, when we get to the end, the Master of Masters and the Foretellers are gone, leaving the Daybreak Town they worked so hard to rule over in ashes and disarray. This parallel also can be pretty on the nose. In Ragnarok, while the gods and man were waging war amongst one another, a plethora of natural disasters aided the destruction, eventually leaving the world submerged in water. When we look at this particular scene with Skuld and Ephemer, we see Daybreak Town being completely ravaged by heavy winds and other destructive forces. Then, when we reach the end of the chaos, what do we find? We find the world known as Daybreak Town completely submerged in water, just like the Ragnarok myth. And Ephemer, as the survivor, is tasked with rebuilding civilization, much like the human and god survivors in Ragnarok as well. This parallel is probably my favorite. This passage is from the Poetic Edda and is a recounting of the events of Ragnarok, and it has a lot of overlap with the Keyblade War. The passage is as follows. Brothers will fight and kill each other. Sisters' children will defile kinship. It is harsh in the world, whoredom rife. An axe age, a sword age, shields are riven. A wind age, a wolf age, before the world goes headlong. No man will have mercy on another. This passage helps to illustrate that Ragnarok is not simply an apocalyptic event, but it's an event that man and God have in a sense brought on themselves. Brothers took arms up against each other. Mothers' children betrayed them. An age of raised weapons and no mercy for your fellow man. This passage bears eerily similar vibes to that of the Keyblade War, where there was no mercy, and unions and children who used to live in harmony with one another began to raise their blades to strike each other down. This next parallel comes by way of the Gjallarhorn, man I hope I'm saying that right, and the clock tower. In Ragnarok, the Gjallarhorn was blown by Heimdall to signal the beginning of the Ragnarok event. Now, in Union Cross, we don't get any such character blowing a horn, but the beginning of the Keyblade War is signaled by the ringing of the clock tower. So the parallel here is simply the idea that the beginning of the apocalyptic event will have an audible signal that will play an eerie tone signaling the beginning of the end. This last parallel seems to line up, but how Dark Road plays out may ultimately decide it. Anyway, in Norse mythology, Balder is one of the surviving gods who helps to rebuild the world after Ragnarok. Now, as we went over earlier, Ephemer survives the war, and as we know, he goes on to build and create the city/civilization of Skala ad Kylum, where Balder eventually would inhabit. Could this be a tip of the cap to Balder being one of the gods to rebuild the world? Could be, but I find it hard to find his inclusion in the story as merely a coincidence, especially since he shows up after the fall of Daybreak Town and in this rebuilt world. Ragnarok is one of the most epic and beloved stories in all of mythology. We have seen its influence on pop culture in movies, shows, and video games. Kingdom Hearts has always been inspired by mythology, and it seems as though Norse mythology is one of the biggest influences in some of the story's newest developments. Looking over all of these parallels, it's hard for me not to believe that the Union Cross finale was absolutely inspired by the story of Ragnarok. And with the inclusion of characters like Odin and Balder in Dark Road, it seems as though this Norse mythology trend is poised to continue. But what do you think, dearest viewer? Do you believe the Union Cross was inspired by Ragnarok? Were there any parallels that I missed? Will Dark Road ever come out? Let me know. But until then, ladies and gentlemen, you all be good out there. Be good to each other. Keep on crushing, and I will see all of you sickos and normies next time.